Thousands of years ago, the first mead makers didn't buy yeast packets. They didn't even know yeast existed. So how did their honey wine ferment? The answer is wild yeast. Invisible microbes clinging to flowers, floating on the wind, and living in raw honeycombs. That's the same force we could tap into today if we're willing to trust nature. So here's the mind-bending part. Yeast is everywhere, on berries, on fruit skins, and even floating through the air. The trick is catching it in a way that's safe, controlled, and gives you flavors worth drinking. One simple method is the fruit trap. You take fruit with skins covered with natural yeast, like grapes, blueberries, or plums, and drop them into a jar with a little diluted honey water. Cover it loosely, and if it comes alive with bubbles in a day or two, you've just trapped a wild culture. Here's the key detail most people miss. Once it bubbles, you need to grow it out. That means feeding it more diluted honey water and giving it oxygen early so the yeast population expands. Keep it loosely covered, swirl it daily, and if it smells pleasantly fruity after several days, you've built a starter strong enough to pitch into a gallon batch. If it smells off, dump it and try again. Another method is the flower trap. Pick blossoms when they're fresh and fragrant, because that's when yeast is most active. Drop them in the same kind of honey water and watch for signs of life. Then there's raw honey itself. This is the most fascinating one. A teaspoon of raw, unfiltered honey mixed into a little water can sometimes spring to life because natural yeast lives on the pollen grains, bits of wax, and dust carried by the bees. Not every jar will ferment, but when it does, you've caught something special. But yeast alone won't give you mead. You still need honey for the must. And here's where the choices you make matter just as much as the yeast. For making a full batch of mead, you'll want several pounds of good quality honey. The wild yeast you captured might come from raw honey, but that teaspoon won't be nearly enough to ferment a gallon. You need to gather or buy honey separately to provide the sugar that drives fermentation. The best choice is raw, unfiltered honey from a local beekeeper or farmer's market. Not only does it taste better, but it still carries the subtle flavors of your region. Wildflowers, clover, orange blossoms, whatever the bees were visiting. Those flavors carry straight into the mead. Yes, you can buy honey from the grocery store, but most of it has been pasteurized or filtered. It will still ferment, but the flavor will be flatter, but you'll miss out on the unique character of local honey. And if you're lucky enough to get the comb or cappings from a beekeeper, you just don't get must honey. You sometimes get bonus wild microbes too. And that's nature's starter kit in one package. Now, here's a catch. Not every wild microbe is your friend. So, how do we let the good ones thrive without letting the bad ones ruin the batch? When honey is diluted, it naturally makes a tiny bit of hydrogen peroxide. That helps slow down unwanted microbes, but it's not enough on its own. What really keeps your wild mead safe are three things. Sanitation. Always clean your jars, spoons, and anything that touches the must. Acidifying. Make sure your pH is below 4.6 because most harmful microbes can't grow in an acidic environment. Adding a little lemon juice or acid blend helps this. And then oxygen control. Give oxygen in the beginning so that yeast multiplies, but once fermentation is underway, keep it sealed to prevent spoilage. These steps are simple, but they make the difference between wild and undrinkable. So, what does this really taste like? I tested 3 bottles side by side, and the results will surprise you. The wild mead shows me exactly what the local yeast can do. Sometimes it's magical with bright rustic flavors, other times it stalls, or turns funky in a way you might not want. The wild mead is usually the winner. The wild yeast kicks off fermentation, building aromas in the first few days. Then, a clean commercial yeast finishes the job. You can get character and reliability. The commercial-only mead is good, but predictable. Clean, safe, repeatable, but missing that wild spark. The benefit of the wild first method is balance. You capture those complex notes from nature, but you don't risk losing an entire batch to a stubborn or weak yeast. Here's the best part. Once you've caught a wild culture you like, scaling it up is easy. I make a gallon of traditional mead, check that the pH is under 4.6, and give it oxygen at the start. Then I pitch the wild culture first, then let it run for 1 to 3 days. After that, I add a reliable finishing yeast to carry it to the end. I feed nutrients lightly at first, then more once the finisher is active. I keep the temperature steady, warm enough to keep fermentation moving, but cold enough to avoid harsh flavors, usually around 68 to 70 degrees, in that range. If you really like the profile of your wild culture, you can preserve it. Store it in a mason jar in the fridge and refresh it every few weeks with a little fresh honey water. Or freeze a glycerol solution if you want long-term storage. That way, your land's microbes become a repeatable ingredient in your mead-making toolkit. So, what's the wild foraging trick I teased at the start? It's this. The most complex meads often come from letting wild yeast start the party and then handing the baton off to commercial yeast. That's the balance between flavor and control. It's ancient tradition meeting modern science. When you sip that mead, you're not just drinking honey wine, you're tasting your land, your flowers, your season, a flavor that no store-bought yeast could ever create. And that's the soul of wild mead. And if you want to keep exploring the world of mead, from ancient traditions to modern techniques, make sure to hit the like and subscribe to the channel. Ready to go deeper? The Practical Mead-Maker ebook covers honey, water, flavor, balance, off-flavor fixes, and step-by-step troubleshooting. You'll find the link below. Also, check out my other videos and playlists over here. Happy mead making. Enjoy foraging for wild yeast.